A young man was found lying face down in a pool of blood at the bottom of a staircase. His wife said he had fallen. The police said that was impossible. What really happened that night in a quiet New Haven, Indiana home would become one of the most controversial cases in the town's history. A case that seemed like a tragic accident, but turned into an investigation of something far more sinister. The marriage of Kevin and Allison Davis appeared ordinary from the outside. They lived in a modest neighborhood where people knew each other's names and waved from their driveways. But behind the closed doors of their home, a different story was unfolding, one that would end in tragedy and leave a community divided over what constitutes justice. Kevin Davis was 30 years old, described by those who knew him as gentle and quiet. He went to work every day without complaint, kept to himself mostly, and seemed like the kind of person who avoided conflict whenever possible. His friends would later say he was the type who would rather walk away from an argument than escalate it. He was not someone who raised his voice or caused problems. In many ways, he was unremarkable in the best sense of the word, living a simple life and asking for little in return. Allison Davis was different. Those who knew her described a woman with a strong personality, someone who liked things done a certain way. She could be intense, quick to anger when things didn't go according to plan. In their marriage, these differences created friction. Neighbors occasionally heard raised voices coming from the Davis home, sharp exchanges that would suddenly go quiet when a door slammed shut. Most people in the neighborhood assumed it was normal marital discord, the kind of arguments that happen in any relationship. One neighbor would later recall hearing shouting from time to time, but noted that the couple was quick to close their doors and windows when tensions rose. No one imagined it would end the way it did. The morning of August 12, 2023 began like any other in New Haven. The streets were quiet in the hours before dawn, most residents asleep in their beds. Then sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, a 911 call shattered the silence. The voice on the other end was frantic, breathless with panic. It was Allison Davis reporting that her husband had fallen down the stairs and was not breathing. She needed help immediately. Emergency medical services arrived at the Davis home within minutes. What they found would raise immediate questions. Kevin Davis was lying face down at the base of the staircase, a substantial pool of blood beneath his head. The blood was fresh, still wet and bright red. Allison was visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she explained that Kevin had gone downstairs and slipped. She said she had been asleep and woke to find him like this. The paramedics began their assessment, but even before they moved him, something felt wrong to those first responders. The injuries they could see did not align with what they would expect from a simple fall down the stairs. When the police arrived, they began their own examination of the scene. Standard protocol required them to document everything. Take photographs, measure distances, and look for any evidence that might explain what happened. What they found troubled them immediately. The staircase itself was unremarkable, a typical residential design with no unusual features. There were no bottles or objects on the steps that might have caused someone to trip. There were no scuff marks or signs of sliding that would indicate someone had lost their footing and tumbled down multiple steps. Most significantly, the pattern of blood at the scene did not originate from the location where Kevin's body lay. Instead, there were traces near a corner wall suggesting that the initial injury had occurred elsewhere and the body had been moved or had moved after the fact. The injuries to Kevin's head presented another problem. He had sustained 2 significant wounds to his skull, both indicating substantial force. Medical professionals and experienced investigators know that falls down residential staircases typically produce 1 point of impact, not multiple severe trauma sites. A person falling might hit their head once, perhaps twice, if they tumbled in a particularly unfortunate way, but the nature of these injuries suggested something different. The force required to create such damage was inconsistent with the mechanics of a typical fall. One of the officers at the scene, a veteran with years of experience examining accident scenes, stated plainly that these injuries did not match the story being told. This was not an accident. This was an assault. As investigators began to interview Allison Davis more thoroughly, inconsistencies in her account emerged. Her initial statement was that Kevin had slipped on the stairs. When pressed for details, she modified this to suggest he might have been intoxicated and lost his balance. Later, she claimed she had been asleep and heard nothing until she discovered him at the bottom of the stairs. Each telling of the story contained slightly different details, shifts that raised red flags for the detectives working the case. The investigation moved forward on multiple fronts. Toxicology tests were ordered to determine if Kevin had indeed been drinking heavily as Allison had suggested. The results came back showing minimal alcohol in his system, certainly not enough to cause the kind of impairment that would lead to a fatal fall. More intriguing was data recovered from Kevin's fitness tracking device. The Fitbit he wore recorded a sudden spike in his heart rate in the time period before his death. This physiological response indicated stress or physical exertion, possibly a struggle or confrontation rather than the gradual decline one might expect from someone sleepily making their way downstairs in the middle of the night. Neighbors were canvassed for any information they might have. One neighbor mentioned having a security camera that captured audio from the street. When police reviewed this footage, they found that it had recorded sounds of an argument coming from the Davis home on the night in question. The timeline was becoming clearer, and it did not support the narrative of an accidental fall. The medical examiner's report proved to be crucial. Kevin Davis had died from multiple traumatic injuries to the head. The autopsy revealed not just the obvious wounds from that night, but also evidence of older injuries in various stages of healing. There were fractures to facial bones and bruising that predated the fatal incident. This pattern suggested a history of physical trauma, not a single unfortunate accident. The forensic pathologist was unequivocal in the conclusion that the injuries sustained by Kevin could not have been self-inflicted through a fall. The wounds indicated the application of significant force, the kind delivered by another person, not by gravity and bad luck. Blood spatter analysis added another layer of evidence. When someone falls, blood from an injury tends to pool or drip in predictable patterns. What investigators found at the Davis home included cast-off spatter, the kind created when an object or surface in motion makes contact with a blood source. This type of pattern is not present in fall scenarios. It is, however, consistent with impact from a strike or blow. The physical evidence was painting a picture that contradicted the story of an accident. As detectives dug deeper into the Davis marriage, a troubling history emerged. Friends of Kevin reported that he had expressed unhappiness in recent months. He had confided that the relationship had become unbearable and that he was considering leaving. Those close to him described a pattern of behavior from Allison that included jealousy without clear cause, tight control over household finances, and verbal threats. Kevin had apparently felt trapped, unsure how to extract himself from a situation that was making him miserable. In the days leading up to his death, he had told a friend that he thought he needed to leave, that he could not continue living the way he had been. During extended interrogation, Allison Davis was confronted with the mounting evidence. Detectives noted that she could not account for a 45-minute gap in the timeline she had provided for the night of Kevin's death. When asked to explain where she was and what she was doing during this period, her answers were vague and contradictory. Analysis of her phone records revealed something even more damning. Before she placed the 911 call reporting Kevin's fall, she had conducted internet searches for information about injuries from falling downstairs. This suggested premeditation, or at minimum an attempt to stage a scene to make a homicide appear accidental. In October 2023, 2 months after Kevin's death, police officially declared the case a homicide. The investigation had moved from treating the incident as a potential accident to pursuing it as a criminal matter. The evidence they had gathered from the forensic analysis to the inconsistencies in Allison's statements had convinced them that Kevin Davis had been murdered. In December 2023, Allison Davis was arrested and charged with murder. She was taken into custody and held without bond, denied the opportunity for direct visitation during her detention. For 17 months, she remained in jail awaiting trial, maintaining her innocence while prosecutors built their case. The pre-trial period was lengthy as both sides prepared their arguments and assembled their expert witnesses. The defense worked to challenge the prosecution's theory, while Allison sat in a cell separated from her family by plexiglass during the limited visits she was permitted. When the trial finally began in May 2025, nearly 2 years after Kevin's death, the courtroom became a battleground of competing expert testimonies. The prosecution laid out what they believed had happened. Their theory was that Allison and Kevin had argued that night, as they had many times before, but this confrontation had escalated beyond verbal exchanges. The prosecution argued that Allison had struck Kevin with enough force to cause severe head trauma, that she had either slammed his head against a wall or the staircase itself multiple times. After he was incapacitated or dead, they contended she had positioned his body at the bottom of the stairs to create the appearance of an accidental fall. The physical evidence, the inconsistent statements, the suspicious internet searches, and the history of domestic conflict all pointed in the prosecution's view to a clear narrative of murder disguised as a household accident. The defense presented a different interpretation of the evidence. They acknowledged that Kevin had died from head injuries, but argued that these could have resulted from a single impact during a fall that caused his brain to shift violently within his skull, creating multiple points of internal damage. They suggested that the blood patterns could be explained by the way Kevin's body settled after falling, that the internet searches were the panicked actions of a woman trying to understand what had happened to her husband, and that the prior injuries Kevin had sustained were unrelated to the night in question, perhaps from work accidents or recreational activities. The defense painted Allison as a grieving widow who had been unjustly accused, a woman who had lost her husband and was now being blamed for his death based on circumstantial evidence and theoretical reconstructions. After 4 days of testimony, evidence presentation, and legal arguments, the case went to the jury. The 12 citizens tasked with determining Allison Davis's fate deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, their verdict shocked many who had been following the case closely. They found Allison Davis not guilty of murder. The reaction to the verdict was mixed and intense. The lead detective on the case refused to accept the outcome, stating publicly that he remained 100% certain that Allison had gotten away with killing her husband. He expressed frustration with what he saw as a failure of the justice system to hold someone accountable for an obvious crime. For him and many in law enforcement who had worked on the investigation, the not guilty verdict felt like a miscarriage of justice, a situation where the evidence clearly pointed to guilt, but the legal system had failed to deliver the appropriate outcome. Following the verdict, Allison Davis left New Haven and moved in with her parents. She declined all requests for interviews, choosing to remain silent about the case and the events of that night. Her father spoke out, however, expressing his belief that a grave injustice had been done. He maintained that his daughter had been wrongfully accused, that she had spent 17 months in jail, awaiting trial for a crime she did not commit, and that the prosecution had pursued charges based on speculation rather than solid proof. In his view, Allison was the victim of overzealous law enforcement and a rush to judgment that ignored reasonable explanations for what had happened. The Kevin Davis case stands as one of those rare instances where a not guilty verdict was rendered, despite significant circumstantial evidence pointing toward guilt. Legal experts who have examined the case note that it highlights the dangers inherent in investigations that may rely too heavily on assumptions and theoretical reconstructions when physical evidence is ambiguous. The crime scene was processed quickly, perhaps too quickly, and some argue that crucial evidence may have been lost or contaminated in those first critical hours. Without a clear and unassailable chain of physical proof connecting Allison to the act of killing Kevin, the prosecution's case ultimately rested on inferences and interpretations that a jury was not willing to accept beyond a reasonable doubt. The standard of proof in American criminal trials is deliberately high. To convict someone of murder, a jury must be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the crime. This is not the same as believing the person probably did it, or even being fairly certain they did it. It requires a level of certainty that leaves no reasonable alternative explanation. In the Davis case, the defense successfully created enough doubt about the prosecution's theory that the jury could not, in good conscience, convict. Whether this represents the system working as intended to protect the innocent from wrongful conviction, or a failure to hold someone accountable for a crime they committed, depends largely on one's perspective and interpretation of the evidence. What remains undisputed is that Kevin Davis is dead, and that his death occurred under circumstances that raised serious questions. A young man who by all accounts was trying to live a quiet life ended up at the bottom of a staircase with fatal injuries. Whether his death was the result of a tragic accident, as the jury ultimately found reasonable doubt to believe, or a carefully staged homicide, as investigators firmly believed, may never be definitively known. What is certain is that a family was shattered, a community was divided, and the legal system was tested in its ability to distinguish between tragedy and crime when the line between them is drawn in blood at the bottom of a staircase. This case serves as a stark reminder that justice is not always synonymous with truth, and that the legal system, while designed to protect the innocent, must operate within the boundaries of provable evidence rather than moral certainty. It also underscores the critical importance of recognizing warning signs in troubled relationships before they escalate to points of no return, and the need for thorough, meticulous investigation when lives hang in the balance. What do you think happened that night in New Haven, Indiana? Based on the facts presented, do you believe the jury reached the right conclusion? Or do you see reasonable doubt differently? Share your perspective in the comments below, keeping the discussion respectful and grounded in the evidence. If you found this case compelling and want to explore more mysterious and unsettling true crime cases, subscribe to our channel. We examine the cases that challenge our understanding of justice, truth, and the thin line between accident and intent. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these important stories to light.